This week on World Traveler Cooking, we're going to make ciabatta. Now, ciabatta is probably the best bread to make if you were just getting started making wheat-based breads. It's relatively easy because it doesn't rely a lot on dough strength. So a lot of things we can practice with this dough are not super critical to its outcome. For example, in this tutorial we will autolyze the wheat, but that's not 100% necessary. People who use a stand mixer typically don't do that. But I think autolyzing the wheat allows you to have a more manageable dough, so we're going to go ahead and do that. So basically, ciabatta is the Italian word for slippers, like the slippers that you put on your feet, you know, when you're in the house or about to go to bed or just get up or whatever. And that is in relation to their shape. Because it's a low dough strength, because the dough has a low strength, the bread tends to spread out rather than puff up as it cooks. And you get a very chewy, delightful bread with a semi-open crumb. So this is a perfect bread to get started with. It's super simple. And if you're trying to get into things like sourdough, it's also an easy entrance into that. Now, I'm not going to do a sourdough version today, but basically if you just save a bit of your dough each time and add a little bit of water and such, and come back the next week and do the same thing, I wouldn't say dough, I would say like the preferment, then it will eventually become a lot more sourdough-like, as the wild yeast eventually replace the active dry yeast that you used the first time. So for ingredients, I will use a packet of active dry yeast, which I didn't bring out for this. I will use a kilogram of flour, and I'm going to use a kilogram because this bread stores easily in the freezer, so it's good to make a lot. And also because this highlights something called baker's percentages. Go over that again in a moment. To a kilogram of flour, I will use 700 milligrams or milliliters of water. Remember, a milliliter weighs milliliter weighs a gram, so that's 700 grams. And I will use 20 grams of salt. Now, when we talk about baker's percentages, basically, baker's percentages mean that you start with your weight of flour and you express everything else in the percentage of the weight of flour to what you're adding. So, this will be a 70% hydration dough. You may need to play with this depending on your flour. Maybe try adding a little more water, try adding a little less water. You could go up to 75% hydration, try 65% hydration, you know. It depends on a bunch of factors, and if you keep a good notebook, you'll be able to play around with this and find out what works for the flour that you can get in your area. A second thing to note is that this is a high-strength bread flour, and we're not going to use an all-purpose flour for this. You probably could, but it's just not going to come out as well. So spend the extra money and get a proper bread flour. So here we have in baker's percentages, 70% on the hydration, 2% on the salt, and about 1% on the yeast. So we have 11 grams of yeast, that'll be 1.1. So basically what we're going to do here, if you look at the various recipes that I've been able to find in Italian, they do use a variety of techniques. This is not a singular bread with a single perfect recipe. So you'll have some people using what's called a poolish, and that's what we're going to do today. You have other people using what's called a biga, and I've used that many times in the past. A poolish has a 100% hydration in your preferment, and that makes it a much looser preferment. It also means you're adding less water to your main dough, which can have some advantages there. So now you'd be kneading in a looser preferment into a thicker autolyzed dough. Similarly, if you use a biga, that's usually a 50% hydration, so cut the water down by 50% on the hydration. You add that rest of the water to your flour. That leads to a softer, more elastic, basically the autolyzed dough, but a firmer preferment. That can also be nice if you're kneading them together. We will be working with the poolish and kneading it together. It's not a big deal one way or the other. You can basically decide, try both and see what works for you. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to divide this flour into two bowls. One will have 300 grams in it, and the other will have 700 grams. Maybe a little more, because I'd add the rest of it to the poolish and maybe add a little more water. The reason for that is I will save a little bit of the poolish afterwards for the next batch. And if you just keep doing that again, you'll end up with something that takes longer for the pre-ferment, but will give it a little bit more of a sourdough flavor. So that part's up to you. So today we're just using active dry yeast though. So let's get started. So in this bowl I have 300, that's actually 320 grams of flour plus my packet of active dry yeast. In this bowl I just have 700 grams of flour. So I'm going to add 300 milliliters of water here. So if it starts out at 700, that means I'm targeting 400 left in the end. And here I'm going to add the rest of my water. And then I'm going to mix these both until there's no more dry flour, and then I will be right back. Okay, so here we have these mixed together. The poolish is a very, very, very loose dough, bordering on a batter. The rest of this is this fairly firm, and yet it's fairly sticky, fairly brittle water-flour mixture. For handling's sake, we're just going to let this sit for an hour and a half, and as this happens, the dough will become less sticky and a lot more stretchy. That's why I do this. Also because, at this stage I'm mixing all of my water together. It's much easier to control hydration and things like that. So I do recommend autolyzing the flour here. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to cover these up so they don't dry out, and we'll be back in an hour and a half. So, an hour and a half later, you can see the poolish is puffed up quite a lot, and the autolyzing mixture is now really stretchy, and it's not nearly as sticky. It's still a little sticky, but it's not too bad. So we'll probably it's probably a good idea to keep your hands wet while working with this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a good-sized spoonful. I'm going to use this to seed my next starter batch. So I'm just going to take a spoonful of the poolish. I'm going to put it in a jar here, and I can put this in the refrigerator or the freezer. And basically what I'll do is I'll feed it before I go, maybe like 8-12 hours before I go to the next stage. So, next thing is we're going to work in the salt. And what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to work the salt into the autolyzing side. Now, a lot of people say you can't work salt in later. That's actually false. Most people who do a lot of white bread stuff do in fact add the salt after everything else, because you want to be able to autolyze this dough, and if you don't autolyze it, it will you won't get the dough strength. But of course we don't care about dough strength, we just want so we're going to knead the salt in. We don't have to knead it all the way in, because then we have to knead in the poolish. Okay, so here, I can take this out.
And see how relatively non-sticky this is. Now what we need to do is we're going to flatten it out. I'm basically going to take a portion of the poolish and I'm going to stretch it on top, and I'm going to knead this again. The thing is that when you knead bread, you are increasing its dough strength, you're also folding it, and you're mixing things through. But that dough strength doesn't last. It degrades while the dough is resting and rising. So this kneading process here, mostly, as far as the final process, is mostly going to just mix everything together. So when I'm done mixing all the poolish in this way, I'll be back and we can talk about the next steps. So here we have the incorporated dough, and it is a lot more sticky than the dough was before. So we're going to let this sit for about an hour, and it will rise up a bit, and then we'll maybe do some coil folds or something. And I have another little bit of dough here that I've added into this bottle. This is just there to measure the rise. I put a rubber band kind of on the approximate center point, and when the dough is doubled in size, then we know it's ready to go in the oven. Now we don't have to score this bread. We don't have to worry about doing everything we need to do to get really good dough strength, but the dough can still be kind of interesting to work with. From here, a lot of people will do stretch and fold, but I also like to do coil folds. So, back in an hour. So this has been a bit more than an hour, and you can see nice bubbles forming, and it is in fact puffing up. Now we're going to lightly knead the dough. Now there are two ways you can do this. People do a stretch and fold. I like to do coil folding. So what we're going to do is we basically pick it up, we basically turn it around, and we will basically get this sort of set of coil folds. And then we'll do this again in about another hour, one more time, and then we'll form our and then we will immediately form our loaves to go in the oven. So we'll be back in an hour. Okay, we're ready for our final kneading. So again, I've wetted my hands, and I want to try very hard not to disturb the air bubbles too much. So I'm not trying to degas the bread. I'm trying to fold it over so that we have some basically nicely homogenized bread dough with nice big air bubbles in it. So now that I've done this, I'm going to cut it into at least 3 pieces. You can cut it into 3 or 6 depending upon how you like it, and then we'll put it on baker's paper and let it do its final rise while we get ready to bake it. So here I have 3 loaves. They're not very pretty right now, but they will get better. They're going to puff up and spread out, and they will continue to develop these nice big air bubbles. At the end here, we'll throw them in the oven, first covered and then uncovered. And of course, we could make these half as wide. You'll see these are going to actually come out nice and wide. But at any rate, we're going to leave these here for an hour. I'll be back, and then we'll start baking them. So now I'm getting ready to put this in the oven. I'm going to just go ahead and cover this with a piece of aluminum foil. And it doesn't have to be aluminum foil. If you have a hard top for this, that would be even better. But this is what I have. So this is going to go in at 200 for about 20 minutes. Then we'll take the aluminum foil off and we'll let it develop a nice crust. So this will go in. I'll be back when it's out. So this loaf puffed up a little more than I would have liked, but it's fine. This is now going to go back in the oven with the cover off, and we'll let it brown up again, probably about 20 minutes. And here we have the first of the loaves. I'm going to set this on the rack to cool down. We need to let it cool down before we try it, so maybe in half an hour or an hour I'll be back for the taste test. In the meantime, I'll start my second loaf. Sorry. So here's the second one, and it's looking really nice. I'm going to set it on the cooling rack, get the last one in the oven, and then we'll do the taste test. So I'm going to cut off the heel here, and this is still warm. You don't have to let it cool down all the way, but you need to let it cool down somewhere. And you're going to note that the crumb here isn't completely open, but it is still a very spongy bread. So this is what the crumb looks like. And I'm just going to take these, I'm going to guess I'm going to have 3 pieces because this looks really good. And I'm just going to put them with some butter because that's probably the best way to, most familiar way to try warm bread. And now for the taste test. Let's start with the complete heel. So I love how chewy this bread is. It's nicely seasoned, right amount of salt. The bottom of the crust is crunchy. That will disappear over time just because the water will redistribute throughout the bread loaf. The crust itself is chewy. The crumb is chewy. It's actually really, really nice. Now, if you find this content interesting, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps my channel grow, helps me out, and it helps you see more of my videos. So please do that. In addition, if you make a dish like this and you do it differently, I'd love to hear how. If you prefer to work with a biga, let me know why in the comments. Obviously, I make my loaves a little bigger than probably would have otherwise. My feet aren't quite big enough for those slippers. At any rate, recipes in the description. Bon appetit, and see you next week.